Hi, Aisha Formanski here with Beaducation.com, and today I'm going to show you how to make bangles, one of my favorite things to make. We're going to use round gauge heavy wire and also flat wire in sterling silver. Now in today's class I use solder wire in medium. I know what you're going to say, Aisha, can I use paste solder? Because I have a lot of paste solder because it's so handy. I did attempt this project with paste solder and it didn't work so well. So check out my soldering. I think you're going to be pretty happy. This technique and the solder wire work great together. Here are the soldering tools we're going to use in today's class. Max flame butane torch and butane fuel, filtered is best. Kiln brick, safety glasses, quench cup, flux brush, solder pick, tweezers. You'll also need to be working on a non-combustible work surface in a well-ventilated room, and don't forget you need a little pickle pot with some pickle. Today I use citric acid. We'll also use a ruler, bracelet gauge, soft measuring tape, heavy duty wire cutter, nylon jaw plier, coarse file, a variety of sanding sticks, a few needle files, and my favorite, the miter vise. Nylon jaw bracelet bending plier, plastic mallet, chasing hammer, steel bench block, and here are the materials that we're using in today's class. This is medium silver solder wire. I chose to use medium because it's stronger than easy, but the flow temperature is lower than hard. So you know, medium, you always go with medium. It's easy breezy, right? 10 gauge round copper wire and 5x1 millimeter sterling silver flat wire. In today's class, we're going to use 10 gauge round wire in copper. It's a really nice malleable wire here. Let's talk about how to measure for making a bangle. There are two methods I'm going to show you. The first is to use this handy dandy bracelet gauge. These are pretty cool. They come with this little locking strap here. And all you do is you take this little peg and you move it around until you find the right size. So let's see here, move this little down to 7 inches. And then I'm gonna slide that little lock over and then try it. Oh, way too small. So slide that back down, lift this up, move the peg over. Now, I do know that my bangle size is 7 3/4, so I'm gonna show you here. Now I have it on 7 3/4. The next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna cut our material, but first we do a little bit of math. So here's our first measurement, 7 3/4 inches. And then we're gonna take the thickness of the material that we're using, right? So we're using the 10 gauge, so I rounded down a little bit here. 2.5 millimeters, multiply it times 3, which gives us 7.5 millimeters. Then I converted that to inches so that we're just working with inches here. And that gives us 8.05. So let's do that cut. My ruler in here. And I'm not going to take into consideration that little nip of metal, you know, when you cut your wire and you get that little pinch piece. So I'm ignoring that little part. Place a mark with my Sharpie marker here. And then with a heavy duty flush cutter, this is our Fat Daddy cutter, I'm going to cut. There we go. That Fat Daddy leaves a really nice flush end here. Next up, we'll do a little bit of cleaning using the miter vise. Creating two flat flush ends on this wire will ensure that we have a successful solder join. This is my favorite tool. I shouldn't say that, I have so many favorite tools. This is one of my favorite tools. It's called the miter vise. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna remove that little nip of metal using this tool and a file. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pass it through the tool here. There's the small diamond notch there. Pass it through the tool, and then I'm gonna clamp it down. These little screws. And I want just that little nip sticking out. I don't want to take off too much material. Remember, we took all that time to measure this correctly. So see that little nip there? All right. So now I'm going to bring in my file. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to file this excess material off. This goes against a few of our rules because what's going to happen is your file is going to hit the steel plate every now and then, but I think it's okay. There's a little bit of damage to the file, but when it comes down to it, this tool is so great and I get these flat flush ends, so I'm okay with the damage. So let's start that filing. All right, I'm gonna keep filing off camera and I'll be right back. I've finished filing the first end of the wire. Here it is, nice and flush. I'll show you the side view. This is what you want to see. When you run your finger across it, you want it to be completely flush with the tool. Next, I'll file the other end. If you don't have a miter vise, you can also use a bench pin to create that flat flush end. And what you do is you lay your wire down on top of the bench pin, get it right up to the edge of the bench pin with the excess material hanging off, and then you take your file and in an up and down motion you can file straight. So what you're doing is the file is straight up and down and you're using the bench pin as that right angle. Like this, and then you go up and down. And to practice best practice, most force is when you're going down and light on the way up. If you don't have a bench pin, you can also use the straight edge of a table. This table wouldn't work because you see how it's rounded. So you'd want a nice straight edge of a table, and then you could do the same thing and then work like this. So those are a couple other options if you don't have a miter vise. Any way you go about it, you want to have two completely flat flush ends. So here's a super close-up of that flat flush end. You can also use flat wire for this project. This is a little stamped piece that I'm going to solder in a little bit. I wanted to show you and talk a little bit about handling the flat wire. You're going to do the same math you did before. So you're going to measure the circumference of the largest part of your hand, and then you're going to take the thickness of the material, multiply it times 3, and add that to the original length. To file the end flush, if you're going to use the miter vise, I wanted to show you what you do. You pass it through the tool here and see that little block. You're going to use that angle and you're going to take your flat wire and you're going to press it firmly against the side there. So, excuse my hand here for a second. I'm going to screw this down to show you all 3 angles. So if you see from the front here, that flat wire is nice and flush, flat against that side block. I know it's hard to see because it's silver on silver, but I'm going to keep rotating here to show you. Here is the side view. That's a lot of material to remove, but it's just for example's sake here. And when you come across the back, you also want to make sure that that flat wire right there is nice and flush up against that block. Shaping this wire into a oval for soldering is pretty easy. So what we're going to do is, with your hands, I want you to take the wire and bend it into a big U like this. Then take both ends and just slowly start to manipulate the two ends together. Don't worry about this being a circle right now. We just need to worry about getting those two ends together. Once my shape looks like this, I want to make sure that these are a nice flat plane. See how there's a V in there? So let's work on pulling those two ends down with a pliers so that they meet. This is a nylon jaw plier. They're pretty great because they don't mar the metal when you grasp it. So you see I'm just going back and forth, pulling the two ends down until they meet. Now, I don't know if you can see this on camera, but there's a little light coming through. What I do is, in my studios, I hold this up to the window. If there's any light coming through, you want to make sure to make some additional adjustments. This is pretty close, but what you're going to do is take it and press the two ends past each other. This is building tension. And then come back and go past, and then pull them back. I have to tell you, normally this takes me a lot longer than this. This one went together really, really quickly. If you don't get frustrated, it does take a lot of little movements with your pliers to get them completely flush and put together. So next up, we'll solder. We're going to use medium wire solder to solder this bangle together. You're going to trim off about 4 millimeter piece of the solder wire. What I like to do, especially for this project, is I flatten it on a bench block with a chasing hammer. That way it won't roll away. So let me bring that in here. It's my little flat piece of solder. I'll get that into position shortly. Let's flux the piece. You see here I have a little pot of flux. This is handy flux, but I like to put it in a little container because if the flux gets contaminated or dirty, it's just a small amount of flux instead of your whole pot. It also seems to keep it moist for longer. So it's a brush. Get some flux here on your brush. Lightly pick up your bangle. You did all that work to get it together. Careful you don't accidentally knock it apart. And brushing on the flux all around that seam. I'm not being really messy with it, but I'm just making sure it's all the way around. I'm actually going to brush a little bit of flux on my solder as well. And then what I do is I place the solder right like that, and then I'm going to lay the seam right on top of that little piece of solder, just like that. Can you see how that's balanced there? Voila. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to slowly heat the piece with the max flame torch, and we're going to use the flux as our gauge to know what's going on, right? We'll heat it up and it'll get a little frosty and dry out a little bit, and then from there it'll go a little dark. After that it'll go clear, transparent, and shiny, and that's when the fun starts to happen, right? So when that happens, I'm going to take the flame and I'm going to focus right on that seam, and I'm going to do what I call feathering. I'm going to feather the seam, concentrating the heat. If the solder doesn't flow right away, I'm going to take a few more passes and continue to heat the bangle. Consistent heat is important with this soldering technique. So let's strike up the torch. Slow and steady wins the pace with this soldering technique. And there we go. Let's talk about what happened. I'm assuming that you could see that. So what happened was the solder flowed immediately to the right, and what I did was I heated the piece, brought the heat back in, and I focused the heat on the left side, which drew it across the seam to the left. This piece is really hot right now, so let's quench it. Woo, fun. All right, I'm going to pickle this and be right back. While our copper bangle is in the pickle, let's chat about soldering flat wire. This is Beaducation 5x1mm sterling silver flat wire. This works great for this technique. You're going to do the exact same thing you did with the round wire. You're going to shape your flat wire into a U shape with your hands. Here, we can just do it like this. And then you're going to pull the two ends in. And then you're going to use your pliers and you're going to work this back and forth, getting the two ends together. Sometimes the two ends come together and they're like this, and people go, it's close enough, the solder will fill it, right? The solder will not fill it, it will just tack it. So make sure you take the time to get those two ends really flush together. And then you're going to place your bangle, just like we did with the round wire, on top of a piece of solder on the kiln brick, and do the same thing. Heat the piece slowly with the max flame torch, and you're going to draw the solder up through the seam. Now this bangle, I tried to find the seam. It's kind of hard, it's very hard to find, which is a really good thing, right? So draw the solder up through the seam and then do a really good job cleaning it up with sandpaper, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And your bangle will be just like this, where you can't even find where the seam is. I think the copper bangle is ready to come out of the pickle, so I'll be right back. Here is our bangle fresh out of the pickle, looking good. I followed it up by wetting a fine brass brush and putting a little liquid soap on the brass brush, and then scrubbing this up. Looks pretty great. Let's now shape it into a circle. There are two different ways you can do that. You can use the nylon bracelet bending pliers, which are pretty cool. And all you do is you have I call this the frowny face of the pliers. Place that inside the bangle, and then just with little movements, you go all the way around, just like this, taking little bites and gripping all the way around. Another way to shape this bangle into round is to use a bracelet mandrel. Here it is, this is a round one. You slide the bangle onto the bracelet mandrel like this, pull it nice and firm. And then with a non-marring mallet, I'm gonna use a plastic one here, you just lightly tap. I'm just striking on those high areas. The bangle is nice and round now. Let's take a look, make sure we don't have any wonky areas. Yeah, that looks pretty good. I did notice while we were hammering that, look, we're not flat. So let's pull in a bench block. And once again with the plastic mallet, I'm just going to lightly tap all the way around. Check my fit here. Looks good. All right, now that's solder. Let's take care of that with some files and some sandpaper. Because we use silver solder today, you're always going to be able to see a little bit of silver, but let's remove this excess. Here is the excess solder I was talking about, so let's take that off. I have here a couple of needle files. This is a Barrett file. And just lightly take the file and pass it across. That excess solder. This takes a little bit of time, but be patient. It's going to be worth it. Having a piece that's well finished is well worth your time. Once I have it nice and smooth on the top there, focus on the center. This is just a little mini file. Go ahead and work the inside of the bangle. You can see I'm going back and forth, which is technically a no-no. You want to go on the push, file on the push. Once you've filed the area well, you want to sand it to get rid of the file marks. I love these sanding sticks. What I tend to do is start with a medium grit and work my way up to the finer grits. Be patient with this process of filing and sanding, because if you do, can you see there's just that little line? That's all you'll have left, and nobody will ever notice that little line. My favorite thing about bangles are all the ways that you can make them truly one of a kind or just for you. So I'm not wearing them today, but normally I wear a whole stack on my wrist. I took them off so as not to distract with all the clanking that I make when I move, but you can do all kinds of things. So this bracelet says, creativity is intelligence having fun. And then I did the Beaducation arrow and a bunch of dots because I just like dots, right? So what you want to do is do all your stamping before you do your final measurement, where you trim and you use the miter vise and you file your ends. Because when you stamp, you disperse the metal, and so this actually grows a little bit. So you're going to take that into consideration. Now with the round bangles, how I do this is I make them, if I'm going to texture them, I make them a little smaller than what I want, because what happens is you make your bangle, and then what I do is I place it back on the bracelet mandrel with a sandbag supporting it. And then I strike the bangle with my texture hammers. Now this stretches the bracelet. Now you're gonna say, well, Aisha, how much does it stretch the bracelet? Well, it depends on how much metal you disperse and how rough and hard you are with your texturing. So you're gonna have to play around a little bit. It could stretch just a little bit, you don't even notice. The benefit to this is if you make a bangle that's too small, you can put it on the bracelet mandrel and just add texture and hammer kind of hard, and you can stretch it up to 1/2 inch. So that's a little tip there on texturing and stamping. The last thing we're going to talk about today is adding darkness into your impressions or texture. There are 2 methods that I use. I use what we call here at Beaducation the quick and dirty method, which is to use Sharpie. The other is liver of sulfur. Now for the bangles, these are going to get wet when you wash your hands, so I wouldn't recommend Sharpie marker. I would use liver of sulfur because it's permanent and it's really pretty. It gives you a really nice dark patina all over the piece. You can of course just leave it naked like this. This is just the natural copper, which I think is great. And look how pretty this little stack is. So thanks for watching my class today. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, make sure to hit that thumbs up button in that bottom right hand corner. And also make sure that you're a subscriber to our YouTube channel. See you next time.